I bought the company. The file confirms it.
You what? Let me see.
It's all there. This changes everything. You're in my office
The
now.
air in the boardroom of Delamini Tech didn't just cool, it crystallized. Zinkley leaned back, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the ergonomic leather of her chair. She let her gaze sweep over the men flanking Min Jae-moon, men in sharp suits who looked like they'd been carved from obsidian and cold sweat. "I've read the tabloids, Mr. Moon," Zinkley said, her voice dropping into a low melodic register that carried to every corner of the silent room. "I know where your seed money comes from. I built this company on transparency and the belief that data should protect people, not exploit them. So let me be clear. I don't date criminals, and I don't sit at their table." A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. Her chief financial officer looked as though he might faint, his eyes darting toward the door. Min Jae didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply stood there, a terrifyingly handsome statue of tailored wool and hidden ink. He took a single step forward, the movement fluid and predatory. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers plucking a silver fountain pen from the mahogany table. "A beautiful sentiment, Miss Delamini," he replied. His voice was a soft, gravelly baritone that felt like a physical weight in the room. "Integrity is a rare commodity. It's exactly why I find your company so undervalued." He didn't look at her as he spoke. He looked at the pen, turning it over in his hand. "However, you're mistaken about one thing. You aren't sitting at my table." He looked up then, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch despite her resolve. He tossed a slim, leather-bound folder onto the table. It slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from her manicured hands. "As of 9 o'clock this accordance, I closed a private acquisition of 62% of Delamini Tech's outstanding shares," Min Jae said quietly. The faint smile returned, not one of warmth, but of absolute crushing victory. "You aren't at my table, Zinkley. I've simply decided to buy yours." Zinkley's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She snatched the folder, her eyes scanning the signatures. The names of her lead investors, the men who had promised her loyalty just yesterday, were scrawled at the bottom in jagged, cowardly ink. She looked up, her face flushed with a mixture of fury and shock. Min Jae leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. She could smell his scent, expensive sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. "Good," he whispered, so low only she could hear. "Because I don't have time for a date. We have a world to rewrite." The scent of fresh cedar and expensive ozone hit Zinkley before she even crossed the threshold. When the glass doors to her executive suite slid open, she froze. The vibrant, sun-drenched sanctuary she had built, filled with South African art and succulence, was gone. In its place stood a minimalist cathedral of obsidian glass and brushed steel. It was sleek, cold, and undeniably masculine. At the center of the room, framed by the floor-to-ceiling view of the city skyline, sat Min Jae-moon. He wasn't in her chair. He was leaning against the edge of her desk, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate tail of a dragon coiled around his forearm. He was scrolling through a digital holographic interface that shouldn't have been installed yet. "You moved my things," Zinkley said, her voice tight with suppressed fury. She didn't move past the doorway, her heels clicking once on the new marble floor like a gunshot. Min Jae didn't look up, but his thumb paused over the display. "I secured them. Sentiment is a vulnerability, Zinkley. In this building, from this moment on, You are the most valuable asset in the country. Assets require a certain level of reinforcement. I am a CEO, not a prisoner, she snapped, finally marching toward him. She stopped just outside his personal space, refusing to let his height intimidate her. You bought shares, Min-jae. You didn't buy my soul. If you think I'm going to sit in this monochrome cage and play house, you're mistaken. Min-jae finally looked at her. His dark eyes were unreadable, yet they held a weight that made the air in the room feel thin. He stood up slowly, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I don't want you to play house, he said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, honeyed baritone. He reached out, not to touch her, but to tap a command on the desk. A grainy, decades-old photograph flickered into life between them. It showed a man with a scarred temple, his face partially obscured by shadows. I want you to do what you promised the world your AI could do. Find the invisible. Zinkley looked at the photo, then back at him. Who is he? A ghost, Min-jae replied, his gaze hardening. The man who broke the code of my family long before I took the throne. My first demand as your majority shareholder is simple. Tune your surveillance algorithms to find him. Every camera, every credit card swipe, every digital footprint on this continent. Find him, and I might let you keep your integrity for another day. Zinkley stared at the image, then at the man who now held her legacy in his hands. She saw the flick of a muscle in his jaw, the first crack in his icy mask. He wasn't just looking for a criminal, he was looking for blood. And if I refuse to turn my life's work into a hitman's tool? Min-jae leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Then you'll learn exactly why they call me a criminal, Zinkley. Don't make me prove you right so soon. The clock on the obsidian wall read 3:14 a.m., the digits casting a ghostly blue glow over the silent office. Zinkley's eyes burned, her fingers hovering over a keyboard that felt heavier with every line of code she wrote. She was deep into the architecture of the ghost's digital footprint, peeling back layers of encrypted aliases that had remained untouched for 20 years. A soft rustle of fabric made her spine stiffen. She hadn't heard him enter. Min-jae was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, but he wasn't looking at the city. He had discarded his dress shirt, draped over the back of a chair, leaving him in only a black silk undershirt that clung to his frame. As he reached up to adjust a vent, the silk shifted, and Zinkley stopped breathing. The tattoos weren't just decorative, they were a narrative in ink. From his collarbone down to his waist, a sprawling masterpiece of traditional Korean inkwork breathed with his movement. Intricate dragons coiled around geometric patterns, their scales shimmering like armor against his skin. It was a visual record of a life lived in the shadows, beautiful, terrifying, and permanent. You're staring, Zinkley, he said, his back still turned to her. It's hard not to, she admitted, her voice raspy from hours of silence. Is that the price of your throne? Every sin marked in black? Min-jae turned slowly. In the dim light, the tattoos on his chest seemed to pulse. He walked toward her desk, picking up a glass of amber liquid he'd left earlier. Sin is a matter of perspective. You look at me and see a criminal who stole your company. I look at the city out that window and see a house of cards held together by the very strings I pull. He leaned over her shoulder, his proximity sending a jolt of unwanted electricity through her. He pointed to a data stream on her monitor, a series of high-frequency trades flashing in red. Those are pension funds. If I stop the criminal flow of black market capital into the private security firms I control, those funds collapse by dawn. Half the city loses their life savings. The legitimate world only functions because I manage the rot they're too polite to acknowledge. Zinkley looked from the screen to the ink on his shoulder, where a dragon's claw seemed to grip his collarbone. So you're the hero of your own story, in Necessary Evil. I'm a pragmatist, he countered, his dark eyes locking onto hers inches away. I do the dirty work so people like you can afford to have morals. But tonight, Zinkley, your hands are as dark as mine. Did you find him? She looked back at the screen, where a single location pinged in a forgotten sector of the shipping docks. She had done it. She had tuned her masterpiece to find a man who was likely marked for death. I found him, she whispered, the weight of the realization settling in her gut. Min-jae reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, a touch so brief it could have been a hallucination. Welcome to the Grey, Zinkley. The grand ballroom of the Onyx Pavilion was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and the suffocating scent of lilies. Zinkley felt the weight of her floor-length emerald silk gown, a dress Min-jae had sent to her office without a note, fitting her perfectly, as if he'd memorized her dimensions by sight. Beside her, Min-jae was a shadow in a tuxedo, his presence casting a pall over the forced laughter of the elite. Keep your chin up, Zinkley, he murmured, his hand settling possessively in the small of her back. They aren't looking at your beauty. They're looking for a weakness in your code. Across the room, a man Zinkley recognized, Arthur Sterling, a billionaire philanthropist celebrated for his global healthcare initiatives, toasted a group of senators. His smile was blinding, the picture of civic virtue. But as they approached, Min-jae leaned in, his voice a cold vibration against her ear. Sterling's latest medical shipment to sub-Saharan Africa? It wasn't vaccines. It was a beta test for a neurosuppressant his labs are developing for the highest bidder. My criminal network is currently the only thing blocking the export of the second batch. Zinkley stiffened. You're lying. He's on the board of 3 humanitarian foundations. Foundations are excellent places to bury bodies, Min-jae replied evenly. As they moved through the crowd, the mask of the legitimate world began to crack. She saw a tech mogul whispering to a known arms trafficker in a darkened alcove. She watched a Supreme Court justice accept a chip from a lobbyist with the practiced grace of a magician. These were the men who had publicly condemned Min-jae Moon, yet here they were, feeding from the same trough, their hands hidden by white gloves, while Min-jae wore his ink in the open. Sterling approached them, his eyes flicking to Zinkley with a predatory hunger that made her skin crawl. Min-jae, I see you've acquired the crown jewel of the tech sector. I hope you're prepared to share her insights. There are certain regulatory hurdles my friends and I could make disappear for a price. Min-jae's grip on Zinkley's waist tightened, a silent warning. Mr. Lamini's insights are not for sale, Arthur. Neither is her conscience. Sterling laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Everyone has a price, Moon. Some of us just pay in currency you can't track. As Sterling walked away, Zinkley looked at Min-jae. For the first time, the man beside her didn't look like the villain of her story. He looked like the only person in the room who wasn't pretending to be a saint. You brought me here to see this, she whispered, her heart racing. I brought you here to see the wolves, Min-jae corrected, his gaze following Sterling. Because tomorrow, they'll try to eat you alive, and you need to decide if you'd rather be protected by a man who admits he's a monster, or one who hides it behind a smile. The exit from the Onyx Pavilion was supposed to be a clean retreat, a silent glide into the armoured interior of Min-jae's sedan. But the air changed before the sound reached them. A sharp, metallic crack echoed off the marble pillars, and the heavy glass of the revolving door shattered into a million diamond-edged shards. "Down!" Min-jae's voice wasn't a shout. It was a command that brooked no hesitation. Before Zinkley could even register the danger, his hand was tangled in the emerald silk of her gown, yanking her behind the stone base of a decorative fountain. He shielded her body with his own, his chest a solid wall against her back. The second shot chipped the granite inches above his head, spraying them both with grey dust. "Don't move," he hissed. He didn't reach for a gun, not yet. Instead, he pulled a compact, encrypted tablet from his inner jacket pocket and thrust it into her shaking hands. "They're using a thermal dampener. My security feed is blind. Use the AI's peripheral acoustic mapping. Find the source of the shockwave." Zinkley's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it blurred her vision. The man she had called a criminal was currently a human shield, his blood, warm and terrifyingly real, seeping from a shallow graze on his cheek, where a glass shard had kissed the skin. I need a localized uplink," she whispered, her fingers flying over the glass. "I am the uplink," he muttered, his eyes scanning the rooftops with a predatory focus. He shifted, his hand moving to the small of her back, grounding her. "Focus, Zinkley. You built the eyes of this city. Use them." She shut out the screaming guests and the smell of gunpowder. She bypassed the corrupted video feeds, diving into the raw data of the building's acoustic sensors. A map formed in neon blue, a 3D rendering of the plaza. 3 shots, 3 ripples in the digital pond. North-northwest, she breathed, the data coalescing. 4th floor of the parking garage, column 4B. He's repositioning. Min-jae didn't hesitate. He tapped a comms unit in his ear, relaying the coordinates with chilling precision. Sector 4, neutralize. No survivors. As the distant sound of suppressed gunfire finished the job, the silence that followed was heavier than the chaos. Min-jae slowly pulled back, his dark eyes searching hers for signs of a break. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who had just ordered a death. "You saved my life," he said, the admission sounding like a debt he hadn't expected to owe. "And you were the shield," she replied, looking at the blood on his face, then at the tablet in her hand. The lines were blurred now. The clean tech and the dirty man had become a single lethal machine. The adrenaline from the shooting had curdled into a cold, hollow ache by the time they returned to the obsidian sanctuary of the office. Min-jae sat at the perimeter, a silent sentinel, shadowed by the flickering blue light of Zinkley's monitors. He didn't pressure her. He simply watched as she tore through the digital layers of her own creation, seeking the source of the breach that had nearly cost them their lives. "The thermal dampener wasn't a fluke," Zinkley whispered, her voice trembling. "They didn't hack my system. They had a key." Her fingers flew across the glass, tracing the lineage of the encryption keys. She expected to find a sophisticated exploit or a brute force entry. Instead, she found a signature, a clean, high-level administrative bypass. It was a digital thumbprint she recognized better than her own. "Professor Vance," she breathed, the name tasting like ash. Vance had been the one to give her the first seed of the algorithm. He was the man who had delivered the eulogy at her father's funeral, the mentor who had told her that tech was the only way to keep the world honest. Min-jae stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. "He didn't just give them a key, Zinkley. He sold the back doors to the Huan Syndicate 6 months ago, before I ever approached you." "No," she snapped, spinning her chair to face him. "He hates people like you. He's spent his entire life advocating for digital ethics. He He would for $20 million and a villa in a country with no extradition treaty, Min-jae countered quietly. He tossed a thin tablet onto her lap. On the screen was a ledger of offshore accounts, the transfers labelled as consulting fees from a shell company linked to the men who had just tried to kill them. Your saint used your genius to fund his retirement. He turned your fortress into a glass house. Zinkley looked back at the monitors, at the code she had thought was untainted. The world felt like it was tilting on its axis. The clear line she had drawn between the criminals like Min-jae and the heroes like Vance were dissolving into a murky, indistinguishable grey. "Everything I built," she whispered, her eyes filling with hot, angry tears. "It was all a lie." Min-jae walked over, but he didn't offer a comfort she wasn't ready to accept. Instead, he leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, pinning her with his gaze. "The code isn't the lie, Zinkley. Your belief in the people who handle it was. You thought the world was divided into monsters and men. You're starting to see that the men are often much worse." She looked at the ink on his arms, then at the betrayal on her screen. The man she had feared was the only one who had been honest about his shadows. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice finally hardening. Min-jae's eyes flashed with a dark, predatory satisfaction. "Now, we stop playing by their rules." The office was swathed in the bruised purple of a pre-dawn sky, the only light emanating from the sprawling holographic maps that Zinkley had torn apart and reassembled. She looked at the data points, the digital ghosts of Professor Vance's offshore accounts, and the Huan Syndicate's encrypted communication nodes. Every flickering light was a sting of betrayal. Min-jae was at the sideboard, pouring a glass of dark liquid, his movements silent and heavy, with a patient, predatory grace. He didn't speak until she stood up, her silhouette sharp against the glowing screens. "Vance is moving," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was cold, clinical, the sound of a system rebooting without its moral filters. "He's at a private airfield in Incheon. The Huan Syndicate is extracting him in 3 hours. If he leaves with the master key to my source code, the Lamini tech becomes their personal playground." Min-jae turned, the glass catching the light. "I have teams within 20 minutes of that airfield, but I've held them back. I wanted to see if you'd try to call the police, Zinkley, to see if you still believe the legitimate world could fix a wound this deep." Zinkley walked toward him, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. The smell of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her, no longer a threat, but a sanctuary. "The police will spend 6 months filing paperwork while Vance sells my soul to the highest bidder," she said, looking up into his dark, searching eyes. "I'm done waiting for permission to protect what's mine." She reached out, her fingers brushing the silk of his sleeve before sliding down to the bare skin of his wrist, right where the dragon's tail curled. "Here is the deal, Min-jae. I am removing the administrative locks. I am giving you full, unrestricted access to the AI's core. Every camera, every microphone, every satellite uplink on the planet is yours to command." Min-jae's pulse thrummed beneath her fingertips, steady and rhythmic. "And the price?" "Neutralize them," she whispered. The word felt heavy, a stone dropped into a dark well. "Not just Vance. The syndicate leaders who bought him. I want them erased from the network. I want their assets frozen, their reputations burned, and their presence removed." Min-jae set his glass down slowly. He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. The line between the CEO and the Mafia boss didn't just blur, it vanished. "You're asking me to be your weapon, Zinkley," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "Once I pull that trigger, there is no going back to the woman who doesn't date criminals." "That woman died in the boardroom," Zinkley replied, her gaze unwavering. "Now, do we have a deal?" Minjae pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "We have an empire." The war didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a heartbeat of absolute silence. Every screen in Minjae's penthouse flickered once, then bled into a searing, static white. The hum of the climate control died, leaving the vast, glass-walled space eerily quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city 70 stories below. Minjae didn't curse. He simply set his phone on the marble kitchen island. "They've cut the liquidity lines," he said, his voice as level as a horizon. "Domestic accounts, offshore reserves, even the private equity shells. I'm effectively bankrupt until sunrise." Zinkley was already at her backup terminal, her fingers dancing across a haptic keyboard. "It's the Juan Syndicate. They didn't just freeze your assets, Minjae. They've used the back doors Vance sold them to initiate a scorched earth protocol on your digital identity. To the world's banking systems, you no longer exist." "And the physical perimeter?" Minjae asked, moving to a hidden wall panel. He pressed his palm to a scanner that hummed with a dying red light. The panel slid back to reveal a rack of tactical gear and sleek, silenced firearms. "The elevators are locked out. The stairwell sensors are dark," Zinkley reported, her face illuminated by the frantic amber glow of her emergency HUD. "They've isolated us. We're in a blackout zone, and I'm seeing 6 heat signatures entering the lobby. They aren't coming to negotiate." Minjae pulled a tactical vest over his black silk shirt, the ink on his forearms flexing as he checked the chamber of a handgun. He looked at Zinkley, not as a superior, but as a partner in a sinking ship. "Can you give me the eyes back? If I'm going to hold the door, I need to know where they're stepping." "I can do better," Zinkley whispered, her eyes narrowing as she dove into the raw machine code. "They think they own my system because they bought a key. They forgot that I am the architect. I'm rerouting the penthouse's internal power to the localized security grid. I'm turning this apartment into a digital labyrinth." As the first heavy thud of a breaching charge echoed from the hallway, the penthouse lights suddenly flared a deep, predatory crimson. Zinkley didn't look away from her screens. "I've got the floor plan, Minjae. I'm venting the fire suppression gas in the foyer to blind them. On your mark." Minjae stepped into the shadows of the foyer, his silhouette melting into the darkness. He looked back at her one last time, a dark pride gleaming in his eyes. "Mark." The silent war had turned loud. Surrounded by glass and steel, the CEO and the Mafia boss stood as the last line of defense, her mind the fortress and his hands the blade. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of suppressed gunfire from the foyer died away, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt pressurized. Minjae was a shadow pressed against the marble pillar, his chest heaving slightly, the dragon on his arm slick with a fine sheen of sweat and dust. Suddenly, every screen in the penthouse, the ones Zinkley had just wrestled back into her control, flickered. A face appeared, superimposed over the security feeds. It was Professor Vance, sitting in a plush leather chair, looking every bit the scholarly mentor she had once loved. "Zinkley," he said, his voice crackling through the emergency speakers. "Stop this madness. You were never meant for this world of blood and ink." Zinkley didn't stop her fingers from moving, but her heart stuttered. You sold me out, Vance. You sold the world out. I secured our future, Vance countered smoothly. The Huan Syndicate is a business just like yours. Minjae Moon is an anomaly, a relic of a violent past that needs to be purged for the new order to rise. They have a proposal for you. One click, Sinclair. On her primary monitor, a red prompt appeared. It was a command override for the penthouse's automated internal defense turrets. Hidden weapons Minjae had installed for a total breach. The crosshairs were already locked onto the heat signature behind the pillar, locked onto Minjae. Kill the cancer, Sinclair, Vance urged, his tone fatherly. Execute the command. The syndicate will restore your shares. They will wipe your record. You can go back to being the girl who builds things for the good of humanity. You can be clean again. Zinkley looked at the red button. It was so simple. One keystroke, and the criminal who had hijacked her life would be gone. She could walk out of this glass tomb, reclaim her reputation, and pretend this dark interlude never happened. Minjae didn't move. He didn't plead. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers across the dim, red-lit room. He looked at the screen, then back at her, a faint, tragic smile touching his lips. He knew the logic of her world. He knew he was the villain in any story but his own. Is that what you want, Zinkley? Minjae asked quietly, his voice steady even as the red laser of the turret painted a dot on his sternum. To go back to a world where the monsters hide behind suits and smiles. Zinkley looked at the professor's face on the screen, the face of integrity that had traded her life for a villa. Then she looked at the tattooed man who had stood between her and a sniper's bullet without a second thought. I don't date criminals, Professor, Zinkley said into the microphone, her voice cold as a winter morning. Her finger hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't hit the red button. With a blur of motion, she executed a rapid-fire sequence of code that blacked out Vance's feed entirely. I partner with them, she whispered. She looked at Minjae, the laser sight vanishing as she shut down the defense grid. The elevators are back online, but they aren't for us. I've sent them down to the lobby, with a little parting gift in the ventilation. Minjae stepped out from behind the pillar, the tension in his shoulders finally breaking into a lethal dark grin. Then let's finish this. The ground hall of the International Trade Summit was a sea of white marble and champagne flutes, a stark contrast to the blood-stained glass of the penthouse. At the center of the stage, Professor Vance sat alongside the directors of the Huan Syndicate, their smiles polished for the cameras. They were here to sign the Global Security Initiative, a document that would effectively codify Zinkley's stolen AI as the new standard for international surveillance. Zinkley walked into the hall, not as a victim, but as a queen. She wore a gown of liquid midnight, her hair styled in a sharp, architectural halo. Beside her, Minjae was the picture of a reformed tycoon, his tattoos hidden beneath a pristine white cuff, though his presence still made the air feel dangerously thin. Vance looked up as they approached the signing table, his eyes gleaming with a victor's pity. Ah, Zinkley, I'm glad you're here to witness the birth of a new era. Dignity in defeat is a rare trait. I'm not here for the ceremony, Professor, Zinkley said, her voice carrying a terrifying stillness. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the tablet in her hand. I'm here to finalize the audit. The syndicate leader chuckled, reaching for the gold-plated pen. The audit is over, Miss Slimini. We own the keys. You own the keys to the house I built, Zinkley replied, her thumb hovering over a single, glowing icon on her screen. But you forgot that I built the ground it stands on. She tapped the screen. In an instant, the giant monitors surrounding the hall flickered. The celebratory graphics vanished, replaced by a cascading waterfall of red code. It wasn't a virus, it was a total systemic dissolution. Zinclay's final algorithm began to strip the syndicate's digital identities in real time. Their bank accounts didn't just freeze, they ceased to exist. Their citizenship records, their property deeds, their very birth certificates were being unwritten by the software they had tried to steal. Vance's smile faltered as his phone began to scream with alerts. The syndicate leader lunged for the tablet, but Min-jae moved with the speed of a striking viper, his hand catching the man's wrist in a grip that promised broken bone. "Stay seated," Min-jae murmured, his dark eyes devoid of mercy. "You're a ghost now, and ghosts don't sign contracts." Zinclay watched as the men who had tried to break her realized they were now non-persons in a world governed by the very data she controlled. The digital execution was silent, bloodless, and absolute. Hours later, they stood on the balcony of Delamini Tech, overlooking a city that had no idea its masters had changed. The wind whipped at Zinclay's gown as she looked down at the tablet, the most powerful weapon on Earth. She had the power now, more than Vance ever dreamed of. Min-jae stepped up behind her, his warmth a familiar weight against the cold night. He didn't say a word, but as he reached out to cover her hand with his, Zinclay didn't pull away. She saw the ink on his wrist and realized she no longer feared the shadow he cast. She had looked into the dark, and for the first time, she had seen herself looking back. "I still don't date criminals, Min-jae," she whispered, turning to face him. Min-jae traced the line of her jaw, his expression softening into something achingly real. "Good, because I think the world is much more afraid of you than it is of me."